Hello friends, Tal here, and welcome to a brand new video. Today talking about my overall thoughts and opinions on the Mythic Emerald Nightmare raid. I did not get a chance to finish making video guides for every single one of the bosses. I went ahead and decided that I needed to scrap that to refocus myself on things that mattered moving forward, being that the Emerald Nightmare raid has finished for quite some time. But I did want to make this video just to quickly talk about my overall thoughts and opinions on the raid as a whole, being that again I didn't get to show you guys the last few most difficult bosses. So to begin with, Emerald Nightmare as a whole was mostly a disappointment. As much as I personally did enjoy various aspects of the raid, I know that overall, as far as difficulty goes, as far as challenge and different mechanics and fights, it was an overall disappointment to the community. And it's easy to see why that would be the case. Things died very quickly. Things weren't very difficult. It was, I would say, probably an interestingly fine beginner raid, but it was definitely hampered by the fact that Mythic Plus dungeons exist and Legendaries exist. Those two things made Emerald Nightmare be less than what it could have been because of how easy it was to overgear and just annihilate the fights. First, so I want to go ahead and talk about each individual fight, and then we'll talk about how overall the state of the game affected the raid and how it went down, essentially. Beginning with Nathendra, of course. Now, this fight was a very easy tank and spank. It wasn't anything too difficult, anything too interesting. There was nothing going on mechanically tank-wise that was really unique or interesting, so we're just going to go ahead and move on from there. It was a fine first fight, nothing too interesting. The rot mechanic and the mind control was maybe a little cool, but overall, nothing special. Moving on into Elarenth Renfero. Now, I like this fight because it definitely put you in a situation where 3 tanking made things easier and 2 tanking made things stressful isn't quite the word I would want to use. Maybe more like you were constantly clenched because you were going to get destroyed. I like the fact that there was the phase transitions between Bird and Spider, that you had to go to different platforms. I like that there was a variety of tank things you had to worry about, such as the Web of Pain, such as picking up the spiders and keeping it far enough away from Elarenth that she didn't get buffed. I like the fact that there was taking care of the spiders with the feather once you jump over, the violent wind soaking, the raking talons, the razor wing. There was a lot of things going on at once that you had to worry about as a tank that made a boss like Nathendra be really boring in comparison. Now, don't get me wrong, this is an easy fight overall, and I highly recommend everyone 3 tank this fight for the most part, because while you can do it 2 tanking, as I've already done a couple times now, it's not as much, you're more at the mercy of how the boss and the tornadoes and everything go. Sometimes the boss just has a stack for 2 seconds, hits the tank that's tanking her, and if you're on spiders, you just get one shot. It's not a lot of fun, to be honest. As I experienced with my Prot Warrior co-tank that I died like 3 times just because he got hit so hard and it was unmitigated. But overall, I mean, it was a fun fight. I enjoyed it. I really, really did enjoy it. And moving from that boss, you go into Ursoc, which was one of the most frustrating things I've ever had to tank. Not because it was hard, but because it was difficult sometimes with my co-tanks for them to understand the tank swap. Now, I'm not here to talk shit, okay? Let's get that clear. I'm not here to talk any shit. But originally, when I tanked this boss, the bleed was doing so much damage to one of my co-tanks that we had to stack the overwhelm up to 4, which involved some crazy little manipulation of the taunt swaps and everything else. I mean, this boss is very simple. Taunt when your co-tank gets a debuff. It doesn't matter what the time on your debuff is. It doesn't matter what you think might happen. If you taunt when the other person gets a debuff, you will never overlap the debuffs. You will always be fine. You will kill the boss. That's all you have to do. That's all you have to do. Instead, I was put into a situation where I had to, obviously, because you're tanking the boss, you're taunting when you need to taunt, you're moving him out of the roar, you're making sure that the adler gets picked up, you're making sure that when it's your charge time that you have something up, because you got to get the boss right back into position. You can't be hit from the back. It's not a lot of things, but it all happens so quickly that you're very focused on it. And on top of that, I was put into a situation where I had to do overwhelm, bleed, overwhelm, overwhelm, bleed, overwhelm, person with the bleed takes, or overwhelm takes the third overwhelm, then I take the bleed, then they take the overwhelm, then I have to make sure I taunt. It's easy on paper, but in the middle of all that mess, it messed up all the timings. And eventually when I started tanking with someone else and we used the normal rotation, I had to then relearn when I was using my cooldowns for each part because I didn't have to go up to 4 anymore. And it was just, oh, Ursoc was my own personal hell. And even now, there are times when someone will get confused and taunt at the wrong time or not taunt. And it's just like, please just taunt when the debuff is on. Please don't do this to me. Overall, I also think Ursoc was a very easy, kind of boring fight. There's not a lot going on. It just happens very quickly. That's like the challenge of it. It's very, very quick. Snap, snap, snap. But it's a fine fight. Then you come over to another personal hell of mine, the Dragons of Nightmare. Now, the Dragons of Nightmare is only difficult for 2 reasons. Number one side almost always has a much harder time than the other because they'll get more flowers, they'll get more debuffs going on, there's a lot more going on healing-wise and things like that. And then if your tanks fuck up the mark. Now, when I tank, I make sure that I have my co-tank set on focus. Why? Because it lets me see debuffs, it lets me figure out what's going on with them. I can yell at a healer to be like, hey, don't let them die. What are you doing? If they're very low. But also, very useful in this fight is that sometimes your debuffs are not at the exact same time. Maybe someone got an extra stack from one of the dragons, and you have to wait an extra 5 seconds to taunt swap. Maybe, your warrior has 3 seconds left on his mark, and he has a habit of heroic leaping right to your dragon, and he's going to get another stack. Things like that. Maybe you need to hold on to your dragon because it's the very last dragon phase with Lethon, who summons spirits that heal the dragon when they reach him, and you're at 6 stacks of the mark. It's time to taunt swap, but your raid hasn't killed the spirits. Let it get up to 8 stacks, then taunt swap. You'll have enough time to do it. You'll get a 9, but you won't go to 10 and get stunned, and you give your raid the time to kill the spirits. Or you don't do any of that and you get fucked up and you get stunned. That was my Dragons of Nightmare experience. It was fun. But to be fair, the fight as a whole is very easy. It's not very complicated, and it's all about having someone just say, swap now. That's all it is, and that's the role I eventually had to take on. Either way, simple fight, easy to deal with, not too interesting, moving on. Now, Il'gynoth was a particularly frustrating boss for me because for the most part you're not really doing much of anything. You have this moment of tanking a Dominator Tentacle in the beginning. It's not very intense because it dies relatively quickly. Then you're tanking a Horrorad, which does a laser beam, which you can stack to 2 or 1 depending on your tanks and just whip it around. That's not a big deal. It's not a problem. And beyond that, you're just helping the raid kill bloods. You're standing in things for the Blossom. And then when the brain opens up, you do as much damage as you can. Honestly, the bosses, as a tank, it's fucking boring. It's awfully boring. The most intense moment of tanking is when you come out of the first brain phase, you go up to the second set of Dominator Tentacles, and you have to burn one down, and then the other one has to live for a while. Like, unless you're burning both of them at the exact same time, stacking them all up and then killing the bloods, which some guilds do, some guilds don't. It depends on your strategy. Remember that everything I'm talking about depends on strategies. For our team, we left one of the Dominator Tentacles up for a little bit of time, and that shit started to hurt. That was it, though. That was the most intense moment of tanking. That was when you had to use all your cooldowns, especially when we didn't have super crazy gear like now. But it was a little bit difficult. It was a little bit frustrating. But overall, the boss as a whole is just boring. It's just so boring. I mean, I suppose if you're a DPS, maybe it's fun because you have to balance not AoEing the shit out of bloods, not AoEing the shit out of bloods team, and just, I hate this boss. This is actually a really dumb boss. It's not fun. It's not interesting. There's nothing to tank. Moving on. Cenarius. Cenarius has a special place in my heart because it is where I became the dragon tank. And this is a little bit of a joke and a little bit of a meme in our raid team right now, but originally we had a person doing the dragons, and we just kept running into a situation where eventually they would die or we would wipe or this or that, and we ended up putting me on dragons. Now, tanking Cenarius isn't that difficult. right? You tank the Ancient next to him, the Ancient dies, you have someone tanking a Cenarius. You usually have to swap on 2 of the spheres. We had a prop paladin so they could actually take the boss for the majority of the time. So when we originally started doing the boss, I was on ads for the most part, and it's really nice to try to control them, get them close enough to the boss where people can do some sort of easier cleave, but not so close to get dread thorns and interrupting the sisters and all that kind of stuff. It's fair enough fun fight, but eventually once I started doing the dragons, that's when things got interesting because it's very much a situation where you're off in the corner by yourself. You have to handle these two dragons. You have to make sure you don't die. And it's not like you're trying to. It's not the most difficult thing in the world by any means, but you have to really just manage yourself, manage your position according to the raid. And if you do that, then they just kill the boss, and it's good. I would say that if I had been doing Cenarius when he starts shooting the spears, that's sort of interesting, I guess, because you have to use a bunch of mitigation to make the puddle as small as possible. It's a fun fight. I don't know why though. That's my issue with it. I enjoy doing the fight, whether I'm tanking dragons or tanking Cenarius, but I don't know why I do when it's really just a pretty relatively simple, easy fight. I think it might just be that I enjoy watching some of my DPS murder themselves on Dreadthorns all the time. Who knows? But I think Cenarius was definitely the pinnacle of the raid. It's definitely the most difficult boss there. It's, this is where you pull out all the stops, the most challenging stuff. Everyone has to play their best because of brambles and everything else you have to deal with there. And a quick note on brambles: if they're going to be doing more mechanics like that can't be tracked by add-ons and people can't have full control over them, I can't even imagine how difficult raiding is going to get if they really rely on that. I don't think Nighthold has as many things like that, but moving forward, raids and dungeons from this point on, if it's more like that, I think the game will become much more harder. And I don't know how I'm gonna feel about that, because again, as a tank, I don't have to deal with brambles besides it covering my path. It wasn't actually on me. If I have to, for example, really pay attention to the model of the boss for how they're going to do a specific attack, and I have no add-on to tell me what's going to happen, that could be a challenging thing. But I don't exactly have a good enough opinion on it because I wasn't the one dealing with brambles. But it's interesting to me for how the game will progress. And then we come to the most disappointing fight in a very long time, Xavius. Xavius Mythic should have had an extra phase. Xavius Mythic should have been the pinnacle of Emerald Nightmare raiding. It should have been a very difficult encounter. And at the end of the day, the only difficult thing about Xavius Mythic was if you're 2 tanking, don't let your tanks get corruption, because then at the end of it, they'll get mind controlled and then you won't be able to kill the boss because at the last 5 seconds or something, it'll kill people. That's all you have to worry about. It was an easy fight. It was not an interesting fight. It's basically the same thing as Heroic. Having people do the Nightmare Blades wrong it's not even that it's a difficult mechanic. It was more frustrating because they would hit you, knock you around, and just piss you off more than anything, especially as a tank when I'm trying not to get corruption because I'm trying to make sure I last through the entire fight. It was a disappointment in every sense of the word. It's kind of cool at the end where all the tentacles come out and you're just kind of dragging him around and trying to burst him down, but overall, I find that fight to be such a dull, boring, monotonous thing. It's the same thing as Heroic, essentially. It's just a disappointment. It's very disappointing. So, and then you go, that's my overall opinions of the entire Emerald Nightmare raid. It's had unique moments, a lot of interesting things for tanks to do, but at the end of the day, overall, it was an incomplete package. It wasn't as difficult as it should have been. It wasn't as interesting as it could have been. But more than anything, I think the fact that you had such powerful gear going into the raid, because you had access to Mythic plus dungeon spam. You had access to legendaries. Some people went into that thing with 3 or 4 legendaries already. That's a ridiculous thing. Not that you can wear more than 2, but you can change them out. You can be more AoE on this AoE boss. You could be more single target on the single target boss. You can have a bunch of 895 best statted gear, crazy trinkets from dungeons, mythic dungeons, not even the raid. Most of the raid gear isn't even that wanted by people. And it was noticeable that people smashed through things that should have been more difficult, like Ursoc. We killed Ursoc the very first week. If he was supposed to be the DPS check, the butcher check, maybe you shouldn't have been able to do that. And I think that it's something that Blizzard is going to have to figure out how they want to do. I love Mythic Plus Dungeons. I would have hated for them to have held back on them even longer than they did because it was good content. It is still good content that people can do. The affixes are really interesting. They have a shining, beautiful thing with these Mythic Plus Dungeons. And even though people did get capped that first week where you couldn't go higher than a certain number until Mythic was released, that was still best in slot gear with the best stats that trumped raid gear, and then as soon as Mythic was open, you could go in and get all the Mythic Plus gear that you really wanted. It was definitely a case of having access to too much too quickly, but I don't know how to fix it. That's the thing. I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, they fucked up, they made a mistake, they should have done this, that. I don't know what the best solution would have been because I was happy that Mythic Dungeons were released. I was happy I had content to do. Maybe they need to have geared the later bosses up a little bit or tuned them a little higher. Not entirely sure. But overall, I think Emerald Nightmare is going to live on as an interesting raid that had a lot of cool things going. I think Brambles, more than anything else, is the big turning point here for us as a community, as a game moving forward. I think that's going to make the biggest difference when more mechanics like that are brought in. Less ability to rely on add-ons to tell us what we need to do or who we need to focus on. I think that's the big turning point here for the game. But beyond that, I don't think anything in Emerald Nightmare is going to really live on in some sort of infamy or some sort of, oh man, remember that great moment there. But anyways, guys, that's my overall thoughts on Mythic Emerald Nightmare. I know it's late. I know that it's taken me some time, but I really just want to get all these thoughts out and just express the way I felt about this raid tier going in through Legion, the very first raid tier, or raid of this tier, especially moving on into Trial of Valor, which was... If you took Emerald Nightmare and all you did was change the tuning of it, that's Trial of Valor. You went, oh, these bosses have some interesting mechanics, but they're overall easy. Great. Now these bosses have interesting mechanics, and God help you if you don't have 895 gear, best in slot trinkets, and an artifact that's completed. That's Trial of Valor. Have fun. That's basically what it feels like, and... I wonder how it's going to play out in the long run moving into Nighthold. But anyways, guys, thank you so much for your time. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you again real soon. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead and drop it a like. You can subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content just like this. And I want to thank the time each and every single one of you took out of your day to go ahead and watch this, as well as a very special thank you to my Patreon patrons who continue to make this dream a reality through their monthly continued support. If you'd like to go ahead and become a Patreon patron, you can go ahead and click right there on the logo. It'll take you right to the page. And other than that, you can go ahead and tweet me or follow me at Tauriel here on Twitter. And I hope you guys have a wonderful, fantastic day. See you guys around.